Rain hammered the tin roof like small fists, and the wind pushed through the cracks in the old wooden walls. Daniel sat by the fire with a cup of cold tea he had forgotten to drink an hour ago. The forest outside his house was black and loud with storm. He liked nights like this. They made the world feel small, and his world had been small for a long time now. He lived alone at the edge of the human settlement on Verdun, far past the last working streetlight, where the trees started and the fences stopped. People in town said he was strange for choosing to live so close to Dragon Land. Daniel never argued with them. He just nodded and went back to fixing whatever machine needed fixing that week. That was his job now. Not the job he used to have, back when he built things that mattered, back before the accident that cost him his position and most of his friends. Out here, nobody asked him about that. Out here, the silence didn't judge him. The fire cracked and settled. Daniel was about to stand up and add another log when he heard it. A scratching sound, faint under the noise of the rain. Then a small, broken cry, almost like a child sobbing but not quite human. He froze, teacup halfway to his mouth. The sound came again, closer this time, right outside his front door. Daniel was not a foolish man. He knew what lived in the forest past his fence. He knew the old warnings about dragon territory, about creatures that could burn a house down without trying. But the sound outside did not sound dangerous. It sounded hurt. He set the cup down and walked to the door. His hand hovered over the old iron lock for a moment. Then he opened it anyway. The wind rushed in, cold and wet, carrying leaves and the smell of storm. On his porch, curled into the smallest shape it could make, was a creature Daniel had only ever seen in old colony records and warning posters. A dragon, but not the giant, fire-breathing terror from those posters. This one was small, barely bigger than a large dog, with scales the color of wet slate and wings folded tight against a thin, trembling body. One wing looked bent wrong. Blood, dark and thin in the rain, ran from a cut along its side. It looked up at him with wide golden eyes and made that same broken sound again. A baby. A dragon baby, alone in the storm, clearly starving and clearly hurt. Every warning Daniel had ever heard told him to shut the door. Dragons were dangerous. Dragons and humans did not mix. The old treaty between the colony and the Dragon Kingdom was thin as paper, built on the idea that both sides simply stayed away from each other. Bringing a dragon, even a baby one, into his home could break something that had taken years to hold together. But the creature was shaking. Its ribs showed faintly under wet scales. It did not look like a monster. It looked like something small and lost that had nowhere else to go. Daniel crouched down slowly, keeping his hands open and visible. "Hey," he said quietly, not sure why he was talking to it at all. "You're not supposed to be here." The dragon baby flinched at his voice, then strangely leaned toward him instead of away. It pressed its small head against his knee and made a sound that was almost a purr, almost a sob. That decided it. Daniel scooped the creature up carefully, mindful of the bent wing, and carried it inside. It weighed less than he expected, all thin bones and damp scales. He kicked the door shut behind him with his heel and laid the dragon down on an old blanket near the fire. Up close in the firelight, he could see the wound along its side better. Not too deep, but it needed cleaning. The wing was the bigger problem, twisted at an angle that made his stomach turn just looking at it. "Okay," Daniel muttered to himself, already moving toward the cabinet where he kept his old field medical kit. "Okay, let's see what we can do." The dragon baby watched him with those gold eyes, no longer crying, just watching, like it was trying to decide if he was safe. Daniel talked to it as he worked, the way he used to talk to nervous machines back when he built things for a living, low and steady, more for the sound of his own voice than anything else. He cleaned the wound first. The creature hissed once, sharp and sudden, but did not pull away. When he moved to the wing, testing gently to see how bad the break really was, it whimpered and pressed closer to him instead of biting, instead of clawing. instead of doing any of the things a wild animal was supposed to do when it was afraid and in pain. "You're trusting the wrong person," Daniel said quietly, wrapping a strip of cloth around the wing to hold it steady. "I don't know the first thing about dragons." The baby dragon blinked slowly at him, then let out a small huff, almost like it disagreed. By the time Daniel finished, the storm outside had eased into a soft, steady rain. He found some dried meat in his stores and offered a piece. The dragon baby snatched it from his fingers so fast he barely saw it move, then looked up at him, clearly wanting more. He fed it until the meat was gone, and only then did the frantic energy in its small body finally settle. It curled up on the blanket by the fire, wing wrapped carefully, and within minutes its breathing slowed into sleep. Daniel sat back against his chair, staring at the small, sleeping shape in his living room. He thought about the warning posters in town. He thought about the treaty. He thought about search parties and old stories of what dragons did to protect their own. Whatever this creature was, wherever it had come from, one thing was clear. This was not going to be a quiet night, and it was not going to be a quiet week either. He looked down at the little dragon sleeping soundly for what was probably the first time in days, and despite every warning in his head, Daniel found himself smiling just a little. "Well," he said softly, to no one but the fire and the sleeping creature, "guess we're doing this now." Outside, the rain kept falling, and somewhere far past the tree line, though Daniel did not know it yet, search parties from the Dragon Kingdom were already moving through the storm, looking for something small and precious that had gone missing from the safest place in their world. By the third morning, Daniel had learned 3 things about his uninvited guest. She hated cold porridge, she loved anything with meat in it, and she had a habit of knocking things off tables just to watch them fall. He had decided to call her Sable, mostly because of the dark, silver sheen her scales took on in sunlight, and because she needed some kind of name if she was going to keep living in his house. She did not seem to mind the name. She perked up every time he said it, ears, or whatever the small ridges on her head were, flicking forward with interest. Her wing was healing slower than Daniel liked, but the wound on her side had already closed into a thin pink line hidden under scale. She still could not fly, could barely manage a few flapping hops before tumbling over, but she moved around the house with surprising speed on all 4s, tail sweeping behind her like a badly aimed broom. Communication was mostly guesswork. Sable did not speak, not in any language Daniel understood, but she was clever. She learned quickly that pointing at the food cabinet meant she was hungry, that sitting quietly by the door meant she wanted to go outside, and that a certain low whine, paired with wide golden eyes, usually got her whatever she wanted from him. "You're spoiled," Daniel told her one morning, watching her demolish a bowl of eggs he had made for himself. "You know that, right?" Sable answered with a satisfied chirp and knocked the empty bowl off the table. His neighbor Corwin noticed the change in him before he ever said a word about it. Corwin was an old man, one of the original settlers who had fought in the border skirmishes before the treaty, and he still walked with the straight back of a soldier even though his knees had long since given up on him. He showed up at Daniel's door 2 days after the storm, leaning on his cane, eyes sharp with suspicion, the moment Sable's small head poked out from behind Daniel's leg. "That," Corwin said slowly, "is a dragon." "I know what it is." "That's a baby dragon, Daniel, in your house." "I know that too." Corwin sat down heavily on the porch steps, shaking his head. "You know there's talk in town. Scouts from the kingdom been seen near the tree line last 2 nights. Word is a royal hatchling went missing during that storm. You understand what that means if they find her here." Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach, though he kept his face calm. "Royal. Rumor says it's the Queen's own daughter, youngest one." Corwin's eyes moved to Sable, who had crept forward to sniff curiously at his cane. "If that's true, and that's her, you've got the entire Dragon Kingdom about to come looking, and dragons don't exactly knock politely before they start burning things down. Sable, as if she understood the tension in the air, pressed herself closer to Daniel's leg and let out a small, worried sound. "She was hurt and starving on my porch," Daniel said quietly. "I wasn't going to leave her out there." "I'm not saying you should have. I'm saying you'd better think fast about what happens next, because this isn't staying quiet for long." Corwin pushed himself back up with a grunt. "You should report it. Colony office, or better, straight to the border patrol. Let them handle the handoff proper before soldiers show up here thinking you stole her." It was good advice. Daniel knew it was good advice. And yet, that night, as Sable curled up against his side by the fire instead of on her own blanket, chirping softly in her sleep, he found himself unable to make the call. Not yet, he told himself. Just a little longer until the wing heals properly, just until she can fly again on her own. The days that followed fell into an odd, comfortable rhythm. Sable helped in her own destructive way with whatever chores Daniel attempted. She helped carry firewood by dragging pieces twice her size across the yard, leaving deep furrows in the dirt. She helped with laundry by pouncing on wet clothes the moment they left the basin. She helped with cooking mostly by sitting directly under Daniel's feet, waiting for anything to drop. Despite the mess, despite the danger Corwin had warned him about, Daniel found himself laughing more than he had in over a year. There was something about the small, stubborn creature following him everywhere, golden eyes tracking his every move like he was the most interesting thing in the world, that filled a quiet space in the house he had stopped noticing was empty. On the fifth evening, Sable managed her first real flight, a short, wobbly loop across the living room that ended with her crashing happily into a stack of pillows Daniel had set out just in case. She looked up at him from the pillow pile, tail wagging hard enough to knock over a lamp, clearly proud of herself. "Careful," Daniel laughed, righting the lamp before it fell. "You're going to bring the house down before the dragons even get here." He said it as a joke. He did not know, not yet, how close to true it would turn out to be. It was 2 nights later, under a clear and starlit sky, that Daniel heard something moving through the trees past his fence. Not the wind, not some small forest animal, something large and something careful, moving with the kind of quiet that only came from creatures used to being feared. Sable heard it too. She went rigid beside him on the porch, ears flat, a low growl building in her small chest, not aimed outward at the trees, Daniel realized with a chill, but aimed protectively in front of him. Whatever was out there, it was close. And judging by the way Sable's growl deepened into something close to fear, it was not simply passing through. The search had found them. The trees at the edge of Daniel's property bent and cracked as something large pushed through them. And for a moment the only sound in the world was Sable's low growl and the pounding of Daniel's own heart. Then the shape stepped into the moonlight, and Daniel finally understood what real fear felt like. There were 5 of them. Dragons, full-grown, nothing like the small, trembling creature pressed against his leg. The smallest of the group stood taller than his roof, with scales like dark hammered metal and wings that blotted out patches of stars when they shifted. At the front walked one with a heavier build and old scars crossing one eye, armor plates fitted along its shoulders and chest, clearly some kind of officer among them. "Human." The voice that came from the scarred one was deep and rough, but the word in his language was clear enough, likely spoken through some translation device fitted at its throat. "Step away from the hatchling." Sable's growl sharpened into something close to a snarl, and she did not move an inch from Daniel's side. Daniel raised both hands slowly, showing they were empty, but he did not step back. "She's hurt. I found her on my porch 3 nights ago, half-starved, wing broken. I've been taking care of her." "You expect us to believe a human simply happened to find the queen's daughter and chose kindness?" The scarred dragon's eyes narrowed, old scar twitching. "Humans do not simply find dragons and offer help." "I didn't know who she was," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady even as his pulse hammered in his ears. "I just knew she was a kid who needed help." Two of the soldiers behind the officer shifted forward, clearly ready to simply take Sable and be done with the conversation. Sable pressed herself flat against Daniel's leg, wings tucked tight, and let out a high, frightened sound that cut through the tense night air. "Wait!" The order came sharp from the scarred officer, one clawed hand raised. His attention had sharpened on Sable's behavior, not Daniel's words. "She fears us." "She's scared," Daniel said quietly. "You came out of the trees at night with soldiers. What did you expect?" The officer's eyes moved between Daniel and Sable for a long, tense moment. Then, slowly, he crouched down, bringing himself closer to eye level with the small dragon, though he kept a careful distance. "Princess Sable," he said, voice gentler now though still edged with authority. "It is Commander Yoren. Your mother has had every soldier in the kingdom searching for you. Come, you are safe now." Sable did not move toward him. Instead, she pressed herself harder against Daniel's leg, small claws digging into the fabric of his pants, and shook her head, an oddly human gesture that seemed to genuinely surprise the commander. Yoren's scarred eye narrowed further, this time not in anger but in confusion. Around him, the other soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. A dragon, especially a royal hatchling, refusing rescue in favor of a human, was clearly not something any of them had prepared for. "She trusts him," one of the younger soldiers muttered, disbelief plain in her voice. "Impossible," another said. "It has been a handful of days. Dragons do not bond that quickly, and certainly not with humans." "And yet," Yoren said slowly, straightening back up, "here we are." Daniel felt Sable trembling against his leg, and something in him, some old stubborn instinct from a life before this quiet forest cabin, refused to let that fear stand unanswered. "Look," he said, forcing his voice level. "I don't know your laws, I don't know your queen, and I sure don't know what's normal for dragons and humans. But I'm not going to make her go somewhere by force if she's this scared. That's not helping her, that's just trading one kind of hurt for another." The words hung in the cold night air. For a long moment, Yoren studied him, scarred eye unreadable, the weight of 5 armed soldiers and an entire kingdom's worth of tension pressing down on the small clearing. Then, unexpectedly, the commander let out a low huff that might have been the dragon equivalent of a tired sigh. "You are either very brave, human, or very foolish, standing before dragon soldiers and refusing to yield the queen's daughter." "Maybe both," Daniel admitted. That earned something close to a rough laugh from one of the younger soldiers, quickly silenced by a sharp look from Yoren. The commander crouched again, this time addressing Sable directly. "Little one, if you will not come without him, then he will come as well. But know this is not a small thing. The queen will have questions, and this human's life may depend on the answers he gives." Sable's growl finally faded. She looked up at Daniel with wide golden eyes, then back at Yoren, and gave a small, hesitant nod, as if agreeing to a deal only she fully understood. Daniel felt his stomach drop even as relief washed through him. Being invited into the Dragon Kingdom instead of having Sable ripped away by force was better than the alternative, certainly. But it also meant walking directly into the heart of a civilization that, until 3 days ago, he had only known through warning posters and old treaty documents. "You will come with us now," Yoren said, turning toward the tree line where the rest of his soldiers were already reassembling into some kind of formation. "It is best the queen sees her daughter safe before the sun climbs too high. Grief makes for poor patience, and she has grieved for 3 days already." Daniel looked down at Sable, who pressed close against him, then up at the 5 dragons waiting in the moonlight, wings shifting restlessly, clearly eager to finally bring their missing princess home. He thought of Corwin's warning. He thought of the treaty, thin as paper. He thought of every reason this could go very, very wrong. Then he took a slow breath, gathered Sable carefully into his arms the way he had that first stormy night, and stepped forward into the trees, following Commander Yoren and his soldiers toward a kingdom no human had willingly entered in longer than Daniel had been alive. Above them, the sky was already beginning to lighten at the edges, the first pale hint of sunrise creeping over the distant mountains, exactly where, Daniel realized with a tightening in his chest, the Dragon Kingdom was said to lie hidden. Sunrise was going to bring him somewhere no human had ever truly been welcomed, and he had no idea if he would be walking back out again. The mountains had looked like ordinary mountains from Daniel's porch, the kind of distant gray shapes a person stopped noticing after enough years living near them. Up close, walking through a hidden pass that Yoren's soldiers navigated without hesitation, Daniel realized how wrong that impression had been. The Dragon Kingdom was not built on the mountains, it was built into them. Cliffs that looked solid from a distance opened into wide terraces carved with impossible precision. Staircases and bridges spun from some dark metal that caught the early morning light like polished stone. Great archways framed the entrances to caverns glowing faintly from within, lit by something other than fire, something Daniel's old engineering instincts itched to understand. Dragons moved everywhere, some walking on two legs in the manner of the soldiers escorting him, others flying between terraces in lazy loops, wings catching the sunrise in shades of copper and slate and deep forest green. It was, Daniel thought, staring openly despite himself, one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen. Sable, still held carefully in his arms, had grown quieter the closer they got, her earlier fear settling into something more like nervous anticipation. Every so often she would chirp softly at passing dragons, most of whom stopped mid-stride, eyes going wide with shock at the sight of their missing princess, alive and held gently in human arms. Word traveled fast. By the time Yoren led them through the largest archway into what Daniel could only assume was the heart of the kingdom, a crowd had already gathered, murmurs rippling through the dragons like wind through tall grass. The throne room, if it could even be called that, was less a room and more an open cavern, its ceiling lost somewhere in shadow far above, its floor a wide platform overlooking a drop that fell away into darkness. At the center, on a raised dais carved from black stone veined with gold, stood Queen Rasha. Daniel had expected size. He had expected power. What he had not expected was the raw, barely contained grief carved into every line of the queen's posture as her eyes fixed on Sable, or the way that grief snapped instantly into fury the moment she registered the human carrying her. "Release my daughter." The queen's voice did not need a translation device to carry weight, though one glowed faintly at her throat regardless. It rolled through the cavern like distant thunder, and every dragon present, soldiers included, flinched. Daniel set Sable down carefully, expecting her to immediately run to her mother. Instead, the small dragon hesitated, glancing between the queen and Daniel before finally moving forward, though slower than Daniel expected, tail curled low. Rasha swept down from the dais so fast Daniel barely tracked the movement, gathering Sable up in a fierce embrace, wings curling protectively around her small form. For a moment, the powerful ruler of an entire kingdom looked like nothing more than a terrified mother, checking every inch of her child for injury. Then her eyes lifted to Daniel again, and the fury returned, colder now, more focused. "Explain," she said, "why my daughter was found in the care of a human before I decide whether you leave this hall breathing." The threat was not empty. Daniel could feel it in the tension rippling through every dragon in the room, the way clawed hands flexed, the way wings shifted restlessly, ready. He kept his voice steady, the same way he had with Yoren in the forest. "I found her 3 nights ago during the storm. She was on my porch, wing broken, bleeding, starving. I didn't know who she was. I just knew she needed help, so I helped her." "A likely story," snapped one of the court advisors standing near the dais, an older dragon with faded scales and sharp, suspicious eyes. Humans have hunted our kind before. Perhaps this one meant to use her as a bargaining tool, or worse, and only panicked when our soldiers found him. If that were true, Yoren said, stepping forward before Daniel could respond, the hatchling would not have refused rescue in favor of remaining at his side. I witnessed it myself. She growled at my own soldiers to protect him. A ripple of surprised murmurs spread through the gathered dragons. Rasha's sharp eyes narrowed, her attention shifting from Daniel to her daughter, still held protectively against her chest. Sable, sensing the tension, wriggled slightly in her mother's grip, then reached one small clawed hand toward Daniel, chirping insistently, the same sound she used when she wanted something and intended to get it. The queen looked between her daughter's outstretched hand and the human standing calmly, if nervously, before her throne. Something in her expression shifted, confusion cutting through the anger, though the suspicion remained sharp underneath. You are either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish, human, Rasha said finally, echoing Yoren's earlier words almost exactly. To stand in my hall and speak so plainly, with your life very much in question. I've been told that twice now today, Daniel said, and immediately wondered if honesty had been the wrong choice when the advisor beside the throne hissed sharply in disapproval. But the queen's eyes, for just a moment, flickered with something that might have been the beginning of grudging respect. 3 days, she said slowly, testing the words. My daughter went missing during the worst storm this season, injured badly enough that our own healers estimate she should not have survived the night unaided. And you claim you simply took her in, asked for nothing, and cared for her as your own. I didn't think about what I'd get out of it, Daniel admitted. I just didn't want to leave a hurt kid out in a storm. The cavern fell silent, the weight of his simple words settling over dragons who had clearly expected excuses, or lies, or fear. Instead, they had gotten only plain truth. Rasha studied him for a long moment, Sable still held close, before finally speaking again, her voice quieter now, though no less commanding. My daughter's wing was healing properly when your soldiers arrived, Yoren. Cleanly set and wrapped, my queen. Whoever tended it knew enough to prevent lasting damage. The queen's gaze returned to Daniel, sharp and assessing in a new way now, less predator and more puzzle solver, trying to understand something that did not fit her expectations. You will remain here, she said finally, until my daughter is fully healed and until I have satisfied myself of the truth in your words. You will be watched closely, human, and you will not leave these grounds without escort. Do you understand the terms? Daniel thought of Corwin's warnings, of the treaty thin as paper, of everything that could still go wrong standing in this cavern full of dragons who had every reason to distrust him. I understand, he said. Sable, still in her mother's arms, let out a satisfied chirp and reached for Daniel again, small claws curling insistently through the air, and despite the danger still humming through the room, despite the suspicious eyes tracking his every move, Daniel found himself stepping forward to take her offered hand, sunrise light spilling gold across the cavern floor behind him. Living inside a mountain took some getting used to. Daniel had been given a small chamber near the healer's wing, close enough that Sable could visit whenever her mother's watchful eye allowed it, which turned out to be often. The room itself was carved smooth from dark stone, warmed by some kind of hidden heating system running through the walls that Daniel spent an embarrassing amount of time trying to figure out just to keep his mind busy. 2 guards stood outside his door at all times. He understood why. Trust was not something the Dragon Kingdom handed out freely, especially not to a human who had appeared out of nowhere holding their missing princess. Still, over the days that followed, small things began to shift. It started with Yoren. The scarred commander had taken to checking on Daniel each morning, ostensibly to ensure he had not caused trouble overnight, though the visits stretched longer each time. Turning into quiet conversations about the kingdom's history, its old war with human settlers generations ago, the careful, fragile peace that followed. "We do not hate humans," Yoren told him one morning, standing at the edge of a terrace overlooking the sprawling caverns below. "We fear what happened once might happen again. Your kind came to this world with weapons that could kill from a great distance, without honor, without warning. Many dragons died before the first treaty was signed." Daniel thought of the old warning posters back home, the ones that painted dragons as mindless, fire-breathing threats. "Nobody ever taught us your side of it," he admitted. "We just learned to stay away." "Staying away is not peace," Yoren said quietly. "It is only postponed conflict." Those words stuck with Daniel longer than he expected. Queen Rasha remained distant, formal, watching him from across rooms with an expression Daniel could not quite read, but even she began to soften in small, almost unnoticeable ways. She stopped assigning extra guards whenever Sable insisted on dragging Daniel along to the healing gardens. She began addressing him by name instead of simply human. Once, watching Sable attempt clumsy loops through the air on her healing wing, while Daniel cheered her on from below, Rasha had allowed herself something dangerously close to a smile. Sable herself thrived. Her wing healed fully within 2 weeks, and she spent every free moment testing it, crashing into far fewer things than she had back at Daniel's cabin, though she still managed to knock a very expensive-looking vase off a terrace ledge during one overly enthusiastic loop. It was during the 3rd week that things began to unravel. Daniel first noticed it in whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever he entered a room, in the newly wary glances from advisors who had previously simply ignored him. Yoren's morning visits grew shorter, his expression tighter, though he refused to explain why whenever Daniel asked. It was Sable, oddly enough, who gave him the first real clue, tugging him one afternoon toward a lower archive chamber she was absolutely not supposed to know existed, chirping insistently the entire way. Inside, illuminated by soft crystal light, Daniel found scattered scrolls and data tablets, technology far older and stranger than anything he had seen elsewhere in the kingdom. Among them, half hidden beneath a fallen stack, was a report bearing the royal seal, detailing supply shipments to the border territories during the exact week of the storm that had brought Sable to his door. Something about the numbers itched at his old engineering instincts. He sat down right there on the archive floor, Sable curling patiently beside him, and began cross-referencing dates, shipment routes, weather patterns. What he found made his stomach turn cold. The storm that separated Sable from her escort had not been entirely natural. Weather manipulation technology, old and rarely used, had been deployed along the border that night, according to hidden activation logs buried deep in the archive. Someone within the kingdom had engineered the storm deliberately, timed precisely to separate the young princess from her guard during a routine border inspection. Someone had wanted her lost, or worse. Daniel brought his findings to Yoren that evening, half expecting to be dismissed or arrested for trespassing into restricted archives. Instead, the commander's scarred face went pale beneath his dark scales as he studied the data. "This confirms what I feared," Yoren said grimly. "There are those within the court who believe peace with humans weakens us. Losing the princess during a supposed accident, especially if she had been found harmed rather than helped, would have given them exactly the excuse they wanted to push the kingdom back toward war. And instead she ended up on my porch," Daniel said slowly, pieces clicking together, "which ruined their plan." "Which made you a very inconvenient complication," Yoren agreed. "I suspect the whispers turning against you these past days are no accident either. Someone wants the court to distrust you before they move again." They brought the evidence to Queen Rasha that same night, in a private chamber far from prying ears. She listened in tense silence as Daniel laid out the timeline, the manipulated storm, the deliberate separation, the careful erasure of most evidence save the fragments Sable had accidentally led him to. When he finished, the queen's expression had hardened into something colder and more dangerous than Daniel had seen from her yet, though this time the fury was not aimed at him. "Names," she said quietly. "Tell me you found names." "One," Daniel said, "buried deep in the authorization logs. I don't know if it's the only one involved, but it's a start." Rasha's claws curled slowly against the arm of her chair, gaze distant with calculation. "Advisor Threll," she said finally, recognizing the name Daniel offered. "He has argued for closing our borders entirely for years. I should have watched him more closely." "There's something else," Yoren added grimly. "If Threll believes his plan failed only because of Daniel's interference, he will not simply allow this to end quietly. A conspiracy this deep does not surrender when discovered. It moves faster, more desperately." As if summoned by the warning itself, a distant horn sounded somewhere deep within the mountain, sharp and urgent, followed swiftly by a second. Rasha rose immediately, wings flaring with sudden tension, sable pressing close and frightened against Daniel's leg once more, the same way she had that very first night on his porch. "That is the alarm for the royal wing," Yoren said, already moving toward the door, voice tight with alarm. "Someone has breached the inner sanctum." Daniel felt the weight of everything he had uncovered settle heavily in his chest as he scooped Sable up protectively, and followed the queen and her commander out into a mountain suddenly filled with shouting, running dragons, and the unmistakable scent of smoke beginning to curl through the corridors. Whatever came next, Daniel understood with grim certainty. It was going to happen fast, and there would be no more time to simply watch from the sidelines. Smoke curled thick through the royal corridors as Daniel ran with Sable clutched tight against his chest, following close behind Yoren and Queen Rasha through passages that echoed with shouting and the heavy beat of wings. They found the source of the alarm in the Royal Archive wing, the very chamber Sable had led Daniel to days earlier. Advisor Threll stood at its center, surrounded by a handful of armed dragons loyal to his cause, a device Daniel did not recognize clutched in his claws, humming with the same energy signature Daniel had traced back to the weather manipulation logs. "Threll," Rasha's voice cracked through the chamber like a whip, fury and betrayal tangled together in that single word. "You would burn our own archives to hide your treason." "I would burn far more than this to save our people from the weakness you invite," Threll snarled, eyes flicking briefly, dangerously toward Daniel. "You bring a human into our halls, let him wander our sacred archives, and now you dare call me the traitor." "You endangered my daughter," Rasha said, voice dropping into something far more dangerous than shouting. "You engineered that storm. You meant for her to be lost or worse." "I meant to remind this kingdom why we do not trust humans," Threll spat. "A tragedy, blamed on human aggression along the border, would have united our people against the weakness of peace. Instead, this one," he gestured sharply at Daniel, "ruined everything with his foolish kindness." The device in Threll's claws pulsed brighter and Yoren's stance shifted immediately, sharp and ready. "That is a resonance charge. He means to collapse the chamber, destroy the remaining evidence, and likely everyone standing in it." Sable whimpered against Daniel's chest, small claws digging into his shirt, and something in Daniel, some old stubborn instinct that had first opened his door to a hurt and hungry stranger, refused to simply stand by and watch this go any further. "You're not fixing anything by doing this," Daniel called out, stepping slightly forward despite Yoren's warning glance. "You're just proving the queen right about people who choose fear over facts." Threll's eyes snapped to him, fury boiling over. "You know nothing of what our people have suffered, human." "Maybe not," Daniel admitted. "But I know a scared little girl showed up at my door starving and hurt, and I know somebody in your own kingdom did that to her on purpose. That's not on humans, that's on you." The words landed hard. Threll's grip on the device tightened, claws trembling. And for one terrible moment Daniel thought he had pushed too far. Then Yoren moved. The commander crossed the distance in a single powerful leap, closing on Threll before the advisor's soldiers could react, claws locking around the wrist holding the humming device. The two dragons crashed backward into a stone pillar, the device sparking wildly between them as they fought for control. Chaos erupted. Threll's loyal soldiers surged forward, only to be met by Rash's fierce counterattack, her wings snapping wide as she drove them back with raw, furious power that left no doubt why she ruled this kingdom. Daniel pressed himself against the nearest wall, shielding Sable's small body with his own as the fight raged around them, sparks and stone dust filling the air. It was Sable, small and healed and braver than any hatchling had any right to be, who saw the danger first. The device, knocked loose in the struggle between Yoren and Threll, spun across the floor, sparking erratically, rolling directly toward a cluster of frightened archive workers cowering near the chamber's exit. Before Daniel could stop her, Sable wriggled free from his arms and darted forward, faster than he had ever seen her move, wings snapping open despite the danger, and scooped the sparking device up in her small claws with a fierce, determined chirp. Sable, no. Daniel lunged after her, heart hammering, but she was already moving, flying, actually flying, higher and faster than her wobbly practice loops back in the healing gardens, carrying the unstable device up through a wide opening in the chamber's ceiling that led out into open sky. She released it just as the resonance charge finally overloaded, the explosion blooming harmlessly high above the mountain in a brilliant flash of light and sound, far from anyone it could have harmed. The chamber fell into stunned silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of exhausted dragons and Threll's final, defeated snarl as Yoren pinned him firmly against the stone floor. Sable glided back down moments later, landing a little roughly, wings trembling with exertion but grinning, if a dragon could be said to grin with obvious pride. Rasha reached her daughter first, gathering her up in a fierce embrace, equal parts relief and disbelief written across her sharp features. "That was reckless," the queen said, voice thick with emotion. "And it was very, very brave." Sable simply chirped happily and nuzzled into her mother's protective wings, clearly unbothered by the scolding buried inside the praise. In the days that followed, Threll and his remaining conspirators were dealt with according to kingdom law, the full truth of the manipulated storm laid bare before the court. Rather than deepening the rift between humans and dragons as Threll had intended, the exposed conspiracy did the opposite, uniting kingdom and colony alike against those who would manufacture conflict rather than earn peace honestly. Queen Rasha stood before Daniel on his final morning in the kingdom, Sable perched happily on her shoulder, the wide cavern behind them bathed in the soft gold light of true sunrise breaking over the mountains. "You came to us as a stranger," the queen said, "distrusted, suspected, threatened. And still you chose honesty, and still you chose to protect my daughter, even when it cost you nothing to walk away." "She knocked on my door first," Daniel said simply, seemed rude not to answer. That earned a genuine laugh from the queen, rare and warm, and beside her Sable chirped in clear agreement, wings fluttering with excitement. "You will always have a place within these halls, Daniel," Rasha said. "Not as a hostage, not as a tool for treaties and politics, but as someone this kingdom now considers family." Daniel looked around at the mountain kingdom that had nearly killed him twice, and instead had become something he never expected to find out here on the edge of nowhere. He looked at Sable, healed and strong and utterly unwilling to let go of the bond formed on a stormy night weeks ago. He thought of his quiet, empty cabin waiting for him back beyond the tree line, and realized, for the first time in a very long while, that emptiness no longer felt permanent. "I'd like that," he said, "but I'm keeping my porch. She still owes me a new lamp." Sable's answering chirp echoed happily across the cavern as the sun rose fully over the Dragon Kingdom, no longer a place of fear and warning posters, but the beginning, Daniel realized, of something neither human nor dragon had truly believed possible until a hungry, hurt little dragon had knocked on the right door, on exactly the right stormy night.